Good afternoon, everyone. Just letting everyone come in from the waiting room. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angelique Moss. I'm with Policy Studies Organization, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session on mass murders in the United States and Brazil. First, we'll have Jessica Fleming presenting intelligent use of data, assessing mass killings in the United States. And then we'll have a presentation from AC Chaves on an overview of the mass murders in Brazil, characteristics, motivations, prevention mechanisms, and legal repercussions. And now I'll turn it over to Jessica. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So this is me. I am going to be sharing some slides. So I just want everyone to know that at some point I may be turning off my video just for connectivity reasons, but don't worry, just follow my voice and then we'll just keep going. And then at the end, I will stop sharing and we can then have the question and answer portion of the presentation. All right, so this is my presentation on mass killings in the United States titled Intelligent Use of Data. This is me, Jessica Fleming, licensed mental health counselor and certified clinical trauma professional. A little bit about me in case you didn't get to the bios, don't worry, neither did I. I initially did this research when I was completing my dissertation at the University of Liverpool. So that's how I actually got started on this research topic. And when I initially presented or submitted a photo for this, I didn't realize that I had this giant mythical bird hanging from my earlobe. So if anyone's clocked that, I am an alumni of the University of Kansas. So rock chalk for anyone out there. If you know, you know. A brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give a historical background of mass killings and then give a brief definition and examples of threat and risk assessment. I will then discuss my current research and the research intentions, my methodology, as well as the research results. And then I will discuss the future implications of those research results. And then we will go into the question and answer portion of the presentation. So mass killings have been defined by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for some time as killings that are defined as 4 or more individuals killed, not inclusive of the perpetrator, in an incident not exceeding 24 hours that is not terrorism, not for secondary gain, and with the ultimate intent to be to kill. So this is not an ends to or a means to an end. It's really an end result. Like someone didn't lose custody of their kids and said, you know, I'm going to go and shoot up the courthouse because I feel like that's going to get my kids back. Because one, that would be irrational. I'm not saying that all mass killings are rational, but it's more like, you know, I lost my kids and this is what I've decided to do. The person has basically decided that there were no other options other than murder, and that is what they chose. I wanted to start with these pictures just because when I give a historical background of mass killings, I'm doing that because mass killings really changed throughout the years. And I put a picture of, if anyone can tell, this is Columbine, because Columbine, although it was one of the most well-known mass killings of our time, is an actually now outdated view of mass killings. Perpetrators aren't usually teenagers, spoilers. Event locations aren't usually schools, and this isn't really the victimology that we see anymore. So although we can learn a lot from Columbine, the reality is that this is just not the prominent type of mass killing. So what I wanted to do was give a historical view of mass killings. And I started in the 1900s. And from the early 1900s to about the 1960s, and mind you, even from decade to decade, from 1910 to 1920, or 1980 and 1990, these decades and waves of mass killings can differentiate very much. But just a general view, starting with the early 1900s, mass killers were found to be mostly racially white, average age in the late 30s. Almost half of them committed suicide during the event. Mass killings occurred mostly in the East and the Midwest regions, and venues rose during this time. And what I mean by that is that firearms were probably maybe a third of all of the ways that people were committing mass killings at the beginning of the 20th century. It could be anything from bludgeoning to starting a fire to strychnine in the well water to bombings. So gun use rose, but it was still quite low. And familicides were most common, and that's basically where someone kills their own family. And victims are mostly family members. And this wave is kind of attributed to economic hardship and depression and poverty, usually in older gentlemen killing their family and then killing themselves to try to save them from the disparity of economic hardship. It's kind of a common theme at the early part of the 20th century. And then from the 1970s to the 2000s, mass killers were found to be mostly racially white, but only about 2/3. The average age was in the late 20s compared to the later 30s, and few were committing suicide. In addition, mass killings occurred more in the southern region and less in the Northeast, and gun use rose but steadied over time, and victims were more likely to be acquaintances more so than family members. And a lot of the wave of the violence in the 1970s, I mean, violent crime rose in the 1970s just in general, and a lot of that is attributed to the increase in use of criminalization of drugs, which is kind of why you see people being younger, they're not committing suicide, they're not really targeting people that they necessarily know that well. And mass killings tend to follow the trends of other violent crimes. So to see that rise in the 1970s is not unlikely. So these are just some examples of how mass killings change over time. And it's important to be aware of these changes just because we use this information in a lot of different ways. So what are some examples of how this information on mass killings can be used? Well, people like to do a lot of research when these things happen. They like to understand these phenomenon, and they end up producing reports and manuals on violent crime. We have some of these here, all of which I got from the Secret Service's website, although the Secret Service didn't necessarily publish all of these, but they have them all in one place, which is nice. So I put these in chronological order, actually, because let's be realistic, we're not really going to be researching violent crime or mass killings unless they've happened, because that would be a little strange. So a lot of these manuals and reports are written in reaction to a conglomerate of mass killings that have probably happened in the recent years. So the first one here is titled The Final Report and Findings of the Safe School Initiative, Implications for the Prevention of School Attacks in the United States, published in 2002, clearly talking about elementary and secondary education and how to keep schools safe. The next is Campus Attacks, Targeted Violence Affecting Institutions of Higher Education, printed in 2010, probably following things like Virginia Tech, looking at safety in universities and colleges. Then published in 2015, we have Attacks on the US Federal Government, 2001, 2013, Threat Assessment Considerations. And we'll talk about what a threat assessment is shortly, but this is clearly, post-September 11th, published in 2015. So it's looking at a lot of attacks or threats that have probably happened towards the federal government. And then lastly, we have Mass Attacks in Public Spaces, published in 2019. This is following things like the Las Vegas shooter attack, and then probably also some attacks that we saw in Europe, where there were a lot of mass public attacks in about 2017, 2018. So in short, people collect this information to understand this phenomena. And one of the other ways that this data can be used is, as I said, and as we saw, in threat assessments. And shortly, a threat assessment is a process that relies upon gathering information to make decisions about what intervention should be implemented to prevent an action, a threat, from occurring. So basically, a threat has been made, information is gathered, an assessment of the threat is done, and decision is made on how to handle it. And the reliability of any assessment, quite frankly, let alone a threat assessment, is determined by the amount of accurate information available. And because I'm discussing mass killings, I'm going to talk about violent threat assessments, or assessing the threat of violence. And some information that has been found helpful to effectively assess a threat of violence includes the suspects, identifying and demographic information, as well as their past responses to stress, as well as any information about the target. So I have some examples of how of actual threat assessments. The first one here is Protective Intelligence and Threat Assessment Investigations, a guide for state and local law enforcement officials. And the other is Threat Assessment in Schools, a guide to managing threatening situations, and to creating safe school climates. And these are clearly specifically for certain populations. Like the first one is clearly targeted towards law enforcement. The other one is targeted to school officials, university administration. And that's great, but there aren't a lot of assessments for everyday people. And that is kind of one of the research intentions that I will speak about shortly. And one of the other things about threat assessments is that, spoilers, unfortunately, not all mass killings actually have a threat that's made. So how do you do a threat assessment with no threat? Well, the answer is that you don't. But there are some other ways in which this research can be used, and that is to assess for risk. So risk assessment, or I'm sorry, risk is viewed as a continuous spectrum that can fluctuate over time with the addition or subtraction of various factors. And risk factors can represent characteristics as well as circumstances contributing to the likelihood of an act occurring. Now you can assess the risk of really anything happening. You can assess the risk of a volcano erupting over a small town. You can assess the risk of it raining on your wedding day. I'm once again talking about mass killings. So I'm going to discuss violence risk assessment specifically. And violence risk assessment is defined as identifying the factors that contribute to an individual's likelihood of being involved in a violent act by assessing the characteristics such as past violence, past crimes, etc., that contribute to that person being involved in that violent act. And below, I have some examples of some actually already prepared for us violent risk assessment tools, hallelujah. The first is the HDR20, which is a 20-point questionnaire going over the historical, clinical, and risk management sections, assessing an individual for future risk of violence. And the second one here is the VRAG-R, or the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide Revised. And this is also a violence risk assessment tool that is used to assess an individual's future risk of violence. And the VRAG-R is actually the assessment tool that I incorporated into my research, and I will discuss that shortly. And by shortly, I mean now. And so here we are at my current research. So some of my research intentions were that I really wanted to see how the data looked. So I didn't create any pre-existing categories for the variables. I really just looked at what the variables really showed. There's a lot of research talking about stuffing data into pre-existing categories and variables, and I really wanted to shy away with that. And it was very exploratory research when I started. And then secondly, I wanted to have a focus on prevention because I don't know anyone who looks into threat or risk assessment who doesn't want to keep things from happening. And then I also wanted to encourage ongoing research in this area. And in addition to this, one of my more adventurous research intentions was to possibly create an assessment tool, policy procedure for the reduction of violent crimes, specifically mass killings, that could actually be utilized by everyday people or various stakeholders instead of just law enforcement or just clinicians. And so getting into the methodology, let's see here. So mass killings were defined as 4 or more individuals killed, not including the perpetrator, no gangs, no terrorism, no secondary gain. The event took less than 24 hours. There was no cooling off period, as there are spree killers, and the cooling off period is like you went to have lunch, or you basically were not focused on like killing. You didn't go from one place to another. You kind of like took a break and cooled off, like actually like stop killing. And usually mass killings are considered to only being one event location, but because so many recently have had more than one, I decided to keep that variable in, and I just counted however many event locations that there were. And that did come out, spoilers, once again, to be kind of its own typology. But that's why you keep it in, so you can see what it does. So for this study, an event was included if it were there were at least 4 victims killed within a 24-hour time period, consisting of no cooling off period, with the only intent being to murder. So as I said, I was looking at mass killing events between 2007 and 2017. There were 91 mass killing events, 36 variables, the perpetrator, event, and victim characteristics were looked at. All of these variables are in fact supported by research, but we just don't have time to get into all of them because there are 36. And I did use SPSS to analyze the data using descriptive statistics, frequency output, and crosstabs, and each factor was analyzed for variable frequency and co-occurrence. So these are the variables. I'm not going to read them all out right now because we are actually going to get into the results. All of these variables were in my initial research at Liverpool, except for prior crimes. I had prior violent acts because I knew prior behavior doesn't always equate into a criminal charge, but I added prior crimes because it's actually one of the factors on the violence risk appraisal guide. And so because it was one of the factors and I really wanted to incorporate this into my research, it was included. And so these are the actual questions on the violence risk appraisal guide, or the VRAG-R. And I was able, actually in purple, you can see the questions that I was able to incorporate into my research. And I was actually like really proud of that because, spoilers, half of my population is actually dead. And usually when you administer this tool, the person is with you and alive. So the fact that I was even historically able to find some of those characteristics, I thought was pretty cool. I think it's cool that a lot of these questions and factors have already been vetted as being keen on assessing violence risk. So when I'm talking about trying to create some type of assessment, this is the kind of thing that I look at when I'm thinking of creating an assessment for mass killings. And then the other good thing about the VRAG-R is that you can actually complete it with less than 5 missing items. And although I don't want, everyday people out here applying clinical tools to other people, if you actually look at some of these questions, history of alcohol or drug problems, marital status at the time of the index offense, these are kind of pedestrian questions. So when it comes to factors for risk of violence and then creating an assessment tool for mass killings, one, I'm really glad that all of these were found in my own data. But then at the same time, the fact is you can have a valid score by discluding some of these items, specifically the antisociality questionnaire. So basically what they're asking for is to go to facet 4 of the PCLR, which is the Harris psychopathy checklist, and assess this person for antisociality. And I know a lot of clinicians who might have problems with that. So we clearly don't want lay people out there doing that. But I was really happy to incorporate this into my research. And let's see here. Now we have gotten to the results section. So it's only going to take about 5 minutes or so for me to go over the perpetrator, victim, and event variables. At the same time, I understand people want to hear, me talk about all of that. So you could probably get by just screenshotting these next 3 slides if you wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and read through them. It's not going to take that long. I'm not going to read out all the categories, but something that I wanted to say about the categories is that if you see it here, it was in the data. So just because I don't say it, it probably only frequented at maybe 1 or 2%, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't there because I didn't report it. So let's get started. All right, so the perpetrator variables were as follows. As I said, teenagers are only 8% of all perpetrators. So that's really not a prominent age that we're seeing anymore. 23% of all perpetrators had the ages between 20 and 25. So that was the most common age group. And 80% of all perpetrators had ages between 20 and 45. 51% of all perpetrators were white, 22% were Black, 9% were Latino, 4% were Asian. 11% of all perpetrators were married at the time of the event, and 13% had a girlfriend or boyfriend. 24% of all perpetrators completed high school, 14% completed college, 5% completed, 14% had some college completion, 5% had completed college, 44% had unknown education level. 24% of all the perpetrators had a blue-collar job, 6% were white collar, 28% were unemployed, and 35% had unknown occupations. 11% of all perpetrators had violent role models. 14% had a preoccupation with weapons, and 28% were at some point in their life enlisted in the military. So the variable of prior crimes, 10% of all perpetrators had only a violent crime history, 28% had only a nonviolent history, and 29% had a both violent and nonviolent history. So really 39% of all perpetrators had some type of violent crime history. And then this is actually looking at almost 70% of all perpetrators had some type of criminal history. 46% of all perpetrators had prior violent acts, 50% had a motive of revenge, 40% had an unknown motive. 45% of all perpetrators had a history of mental health issues. 10% were receiving mental health treatment at the time of the mass killing event. 10% had a state of mind attributed to mental illness, 10% had a state of mind attributed to substance use, and one had a mixture of both. 30% of all perpetrators were actually found to have been using substances at the time of the event. 50%, 52% were not, and 34% were unknown. Half of all mass killing perpetrators had a triggering event that was unknown. Of the known triggering events, 22% were dispute, 14% was the end of the relationship, and 4% was attributed to mental illness. The mode of death, half of the perpetrators, as I said before, are still alive. Half of them, so about 45, were dead, and 30 or 2/3 of those who were dead took their own life at the event, during the mass killing. So as far as the event details, the range per year was about 6 to 11 as far as how many mass killings happened per year. The most frequent number of mass killings per year was 9, and 2013 had the most with 11 events. As far as the month of the year, the range was between 4 and 12. September had the most with 12. The most frequent number per month was 8 mass killings. Day of the week was interesting because Friday was at 15%, Saturday was at 15%, Sunday was 18%, and Monday was 18%. So that's like 70% of all mass killings that occurred on or around the weekend. Time of day was divided into 6-hour increments. The most common 6-hour increment was between 6 a.m. and 12 p.m. and over 40% occurred between 12 p.m. and 12 a.m. The event length, 2/3 occurred in less than 1 hour. There were 8 that were over 6 hours, and some of them were unknown just because even though it happened in a 24-hour period, someone may have been killed at some point earlier, and we just don't exactly know at what time that they actually were killed. As far as event state, California had the highest with 10. The range was between 1 and 10. The most common number per state, if it happened in a state, was 5. The Northeast region had the least amount of mass killings at 17.6, and the West had the highest at 30. Most mass killings happen in an urban area, or at least half, I'm sorry, and 7% were in a rural area. The number of event locations, 71% of all events happen in one location. Of those location types, 42% were in a public location alone, 38% were in a home, and 18 had multiple locations. However, most of the multiple locations were actually public, so the public locations were actually a little more like that, 60%. 68% of all mass killings did not have warning signs, only 18% had a threat, and 4% had online activity that was like alluding to what would happen, but it was not a threat. 60% of all mass killings used one weapon, 3% had a large amount of weapons, which is kind of like a small arsenal. 82% used a firearm or some combination of a firearm and some other objects, and 71% used solely a firearm, and 2% used secondary devices, which is basically not something that they use to kill their victims, but something like setting a fire or planting a bomb that was used in the midst of the mass killing, but it wasn't used to kill people. And then finally, we have the victim variables. And I wanted to just point out, so a target and a victim. So sometimes the people who are targeted are not the people who are killed. And that's really the difference between a target and a victim. So 60% of all the targets were familiar to the perpetrator, 18% were associated with the event location, and 13 were a mixture of the two. 45% of all victim selection was premeditated, but 14% of all victim selection was random, and 14% were related to the event location. 25% of all perpetrators had no relationship with their victims, and 28% were a mixture of known and unknown victims, and the other half were in fact known to the perpetrator. The range of those wounded was between 0 and 850. The most common number wounded was 4, so you can kind of see what the outliers are there, and 40% of all mass killing events had no one wounded. So they basically only killed people. The total killed, the range is between 4 and 58. 38% of all events had only 4 people killed, and over 3/4 of all events had between 4 and 6 people killed. So what does all of this mean? And don't worry, I'm going to wrap up soon, but it's kind of like, okay, so we have all of these frequency distributions, which I think it's always very good to get demographics and know how often something happens, but we also know that these variables don't they don't occur in a vacuum, right? So what I wanted to look at were any patterns that were emerging when the variables were correlated together. And this is what we found. 100%, oh, I'm sorry. So let's see here. So as far as having no criminal charges, that was correlated with having a large amount of weapons, whereas having violent criminal charges was correlated with having a small amount of weapons used during the event, a revenge motive, and prior violent acts. As far as a history of mental illness, having the perpetrator have a history of mental illness, or sorry, having the perpetrator have a history of mental health issues was correlated with the location being the target and events occurring in public places. And the perpetrator having no history of mental illness was correlated with the targets being familiar to the perpetrator and the event occurring in a home. The most popular motive that was known was revenge, and that was highly correlated with the targets being familiar to the perpetrator, the victims being known to the perpetrator, the event occurring in a public place, and threats being made. The event location, if it occurred in a home, was highly correlated with the victims being known to the perpetrator and also correlated with no one being wounded. And if the event occurred in multiple locations, the correlation was between that and the targets and the victims being familiar. So it's basically like this person knew where they were going, even though they killed in more than one event location. The triggering event, if it was unknown, was correlated with an unknown occupation or the perpetrator being unemployed. And it was also correlated with random victim selection. So it's kind of like if we don't know anything about the perpetrator, they may not have a connection with the people that they're going after. And then any triggering event that was known, like the end of a relationship, loss of employment, a dispute, was correlated with a revenge motive. And victim offender relationship, having no relationship with the victim, between the victim and the perpetrator, was correlated with a firearm being used, with events occurring in a public place, and the victim knowing the perpetrator was correlated with weapons other than firearms being used, and a history of mental health issues, the perpetrator. And then finally, we have the target. So if the target was foreign, it was correlated highly with the event occurring in a public place, with the motive being unknown. If the target was familiar, it was correlated with occurring in a home, and then correlated with being killed, with 4 to 5 people being killed during the event. So in some conclusions, which we actually can draw from the data, we can see that events occurring in a home correlated with familiar targets, 4 to 5 people being killed, no one being wounded, no history of mental illness, the victim being known to the perpetrator, and premeditation of victim selection. Events occurring in a public place were correlated with foreign targets, no relationships between victim and perpetrator, the firearm being used, the perpetrator having a history of mental health issues, and an unknown motive. Revenge motives were correlated with familiar targets, victims being known to the perpetrator and occurring in public places. And criminal acts, the amount of weapon used was determined by whether or not someone did or did not have prior criminal acts. And the type of prior criminal act determined whether or not the perpetrator had violent prior acts. So in general, event location was significant in determining several variables, depending on if the event occurred in a home or a public location. Motive was significant in determining victimology, whether or not the relationship to the perpetrator, what that was, and the target. Perpetrator characteristics were consistent and correlated with other variables, such as history of mental health issues correlating with the event location and the victim-offender relationship, and criminal charges correlating with the amount of weapons and prior violent acts. So what are the future implications for this research? So as far as my research intentions, I think, did pretty good. Definitely moved from specific to general and looked at what the data showed. I identified information that would be helpful to a threat or individual risk assessment, and identified an individual actuarial risk assessment tool, the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide revised that can support this theory. And then I definitely, I'm gonna say we're about, a glass, at least half full here, or a little more than half full, because I definitely encourage ongoing research in this area. But as far as creating an assessment specific to this type of violent crime, I believe that the groundwork has been laid, but it's still a task that's kind of incomplete, which is why we're just a little glass, a little overfull. but I definitely collected the necessary information that would contribute to a risk or threat assessment. And I definitely did find tools that were already in support of that, like I said. So the groundwork has been laid, and maybe the next time presenting, I'll present an actual, assessment tool or guide to, combating mass killings. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and just take some questions. So thank you everyone for your time. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I will actually hold questions to the end of the session. So we'll do that. And then now I'll pass it over to Professor Chaves.
Thank you. Good evening to you all. First of all, I just want to share my slides here. Just a second, please. Yeah. I guess now you can see it. So, my research topic is about an overview of mass murders here in Brazil, regarding to characteristics, motivations, prevention mechanisms, and legal repercussions. And I want to thank Dr. Daniel Gutierrez for the opportunity of being here today, sharing the preliminary results of my post-PhD research in São Paulo University. I want to thank my supervisor, Roberto Augusto de Carvalho Campos, who is a professor in São Paulo University as well. And I want to thank Professor James Snow from Upstate Medical University, State University of New York, for all his precious contributions to this research. So regarding to the concept of mass murder, it's a very controversial topic. So this research defines mass murders as an individual or more individuals engaged in killing or attempting to kill the greatest possible number of victims in one or more populated locations in close proximity, generally by the use of firearms. Incidents identified in this study do not encompass all motive victims, homicides, or shootings occurred in public places. For example, were excluded mass killings that resulted from gang or drug violence or from accidental discharge of a firearm. And although mass murders commonly receives a definition of a minimum quantum of victims, normally this number is 4, as a criteria of to the incident being classified as mass murder. This research did not consider this number as a main criteria. The most important thing to define mass murders, we think here, is the accused's mass murder intent and the crime circumstances and motivations. So this would be more interesting, maybe a more interesting criteria to define a mass murder as this type of incident than the number of victims per se. Well, sorry, I guess you're not seeing the changing slides, right? Now, yeah, the concept.
No, for some reason, it's not, the full screen presentation isn't coming up.
Yeah, when I shared the presentation in full screen model, the changing slides were not happening. So I'll have to let this way. I'm so sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Well, so as a result, there were identified 18 mass murders here, incidents here in Brazil between 1999 and 2021. 17 were completed crimes and 1 attempted. In addition, 4 interrupted actions during the planning process. And to gather information for this study, research relied on some official police records and open sources. And although mass murders are still considered uncommon events here in Brazil, this is a type of criminal offense that has progressively increased over the last decade, and especially the last 2 years. So some important data here. In 2 of the 18 incidents, the perpetrator targeted family members, and not only random bystanders, resulting in the death of 5 people. In one of those incidents, victims were exclusively family members who had a close personal relationship with the shooter. In 2021, 4 students were allegedly planning a mass murder at their schools, and they were detained and investigated by the police. And regarding to casualties, victims killed and wounded, they totaled 150 individuals. The individual murder were not included in this total, and among those 150, 53 individuals were killed, and 97 individuals were wounded. In 100%, the total in those 18 events, perpetrators were male. In all but 3 incidents, three incidents involved a single perpetrator, and in half of the incidents occurred in the state of São Paulo, which has the biggest city of the country, which is named São Paulo as well. So in 15 of 18 incidents occurred in an educational environment. In 16 of 18 incidents, the perpetrator was a child, an adolescent, or a young person. Age goes to 10 to 25 years old. And in 10 of the 18 incidents, the perpetrator used exclusively a firearm weapon. Nevertheless, in the past couple of years, knives and offensive weapons were used in 70% of the incidents. Oh, sorry. Here is a profiling of Brazilian murders. It's very similar to perpetrators from other countries. They're male individuals. They're young adolescents. The majority of them were adolescents, and they have some characteristics in common as loneliness, introversion, psychological suffering, social detachment, revengeful feelings. They are violent games enthusiasts. They are members of chains in deep web and dark web, and it's important to clarify this terminology that they use to refer to themselves as chainers, which means they are participants on forums on deep web and dark web, where they feel free to share all their the feelings that they have, hate speech against many groups, and against sometimes towards all the humanity, and to plan the crimes, and to get tips to buy guns and things like this. And they also cultivate the figures of other mass murders. Not only Brazilians mass murders, but also foreigners mass murders as well. They have generally have a history of bullying, victimization. They are described as extremely shy people with suicidal tendencies and low self-esteem. Here I put low self-esteem with narcissistic personality dimensions, although it seems to be a contradiction, because narcissistic personality dimensions are generally faced as a huge concept about themselves. They think they are more important than other people, and how can it coexist with low self-esteem? But what I've been in my research, I concluded that they use those narcissistic features to cover up a feeling of a deep low self-esteem, a deep sense of void and detachment and resentment for being disregarded, for not getting attention for their colleagues in school, for example, or at work, and for being unable to establish close relationships with friends or in love relationships. So a way to deal with this this psychological suffering, which is not exactly linked with mental disorders. Actually, I think the majority of them does not have a classical mental disorder in the sense of having a detachment from the reality. I guess they suffer from psychological suffering, which is inherent of the human nature, and it happens in every people, but everybody. But in they feel it in a deeper sense that so it's so hard to them to deal with this suffering that they try to compensate with this speech, and sometimes they really write it down in their manifestos that they are that they have special abilities, they're smarter, they're braver, they are able to understand the society better than the others. And it's sometimes a cover up of this low self-esteem and this suffering of being, of feeling unfit, of feeling disregarded from their peers. So narcissistic personality dimensions are sometimes just a strategy that they find to face this psychological suffering. So if I could summarize those characteristics, I would have those four aspects here. This schizoid dynamics, so it's a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships. Internet, who has a central role, I guess, in this, at least in the last decade, because in this chance, in dark web or deep web, sometimes in the surface of the internet as well, they find people that are suffering like them, that feel lonely and unable to establish close relationships. So this anger feeling, they feel free to express and to be, and they feel understood and feel embraced by a group. And sometimes they feel that they are members of a community that's going to change the reality by perpetrating massacres against people that they hate. And they choose a symbolic charge as schools or public or governmental building or something like this. So it's a form to, it's a way of facing or getting revenge. It's a payback time against people who inflicted this suffering in them. They they understand it as a way of getting revenge. These narcissistic personality dimensions, mass murders, are an attention-seeking behavior. So they need to feel looked. They're maybe during all their lives they felt like disregarded or felt um, unable to be seen by the other, by the others. So they are seeking for attention. So perpetrating a massacre is the way that they find of being seen by the society, to claim his place in this society where they've never been seen or considered by anybody. So there is this component of getting attention anyhow. It doesn't matter how, if it's a bad attention or a good attention, they want to be seen. And this need of for power and control. Many of them, including the Brazilian mass murders, in their manifestos, they used to talk about this. They use this expression, natural selector. They will act as natural selector. So it's a way of feeling empowered and in control of other people's lives. So they can decide who's going to live, who's going to die, and it gives them a relief when they spend all their lives feeling disregarded. So it's always, I guess, a mechanism of compensating those feelings that they have, and they uh, find a way of have a payback time or a revenge against who they felt humiliated by. And here I put in red suicidal tendencies because those chants or those forums in deep web or dark web has many, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people there. And they all have this hate speech. They all have this, they all talk about violence. They all share violent videos. They all talk about committing crimes, committing massacres in schools and in other places against people that they hate. But who will be the individuals who are actually going to be involved in an act of mass murder? I guess it would be those groups with suicides, those individuals with suicidal tendencies. And it involves suicidal behavior, suicidal ideation, and it's all related with psychological suffering. It's a very important point. Regarding this topic, suicidal tendencies, in my study, in 12 of the 18 incidents were committed by individuals with suicidal tendencies, suicidal behavior or ideation. In 7 of the 18 incidents, the perpetrator committed suicide at the scene of the crime scene, before or when police arrived. In 5 of the 18 incidents, the perpetrator attempted or intended to commit suicide after the attack. So this is a very meaningful number, a very meaningful percentage of people who expresses those tendencies. Maybe there are much more, because I couldn't find data about in many cases I didn't have enough data to evaluate if they have those intentions, if they have this intention of commit suicide or suicidal ideation. So maybe it's more than this 67%. Here are some case studies of mass murders here in Brazil. Here the case 1, the shopping mall mass shooter. It occurred in São Paulo. It was the first mass murder in modern Brazil history that took place in November 3 in 1999, when Meira, a 24-year-old medical student from a well-regarded institution, entered a movie theater at the shopping mall in São Paulo with a shot with a M11 submachine gun against the viewers of the movie Fight Club. 3 people were killed and 4 others injured. And during the attack, an unarmed citizen successfully restrained Meira as he tried to reload the gun, what shows his purpose of killing as many people as possible. And the shooter told the police that he had been planning the attack for 7 years and that he chose Fight Club because the leading character suffered from schizophrenia. And who is Meira? Meira lived alone in an apartment in São Paulo, and he was described as a shy, introverted, apathetic, and social isolated person with a paranoid schizoidynamic and a past record of psychiatric treatment, which was interrupted by him when he started to take drugs as cocaine, crack, and alcohol. Since 1997, Meira was known in the internet due to his habit of sending viruses and pornography to users of the internet provider Magic Link. He used it to spend a lot of time playing violent games like Doom, Duck Nukem, and his defense attorney tried to plead his mental insanity, arguing that Meira has been influenced by Duck Nukem 3D game, in which there was a shooting scene inside a movie theater. However, Meira was considered fully responsible for the crime and was initially sentenced to 120 years imprisonment, a term that was later reduced to 48 years. After he attempted to kill another prison inmate in 2009, he was considered insane and moved to a psychiatric hospital where he remains until today. Meira didn't left a manifesto and never was clear about the reasons of the mass shooting he perpetrated. So it's always a blurry answer that he gives to police or other authorities. And it was never clear what reasons made him do what he has done. But here it was shared by the press some excerpts from letters that Meira wrote to a friend while he was serving prison time. And here I found some narcissistic characteristics, as in this first line here, in the first excerpt here, when he talks to his friend. Alcione, tell me more about your life. Tell me more about you. But then he said, how did you met me in Santa Casa? It's the name of the place he was studying, the institution where he studied medicine. Why did you fall in love with me after I shot people in the cinema? So at the same time that he tells his friend that he wants to know more about her, he turns the question to himself. So it's completely self-centered. It's a completely self-centered question. How did you met me? Why did you fall in love with me? So he wants to know about him in the end, not about his friend. He's not interested about his life, or at least he does not seem to be, because when he at the same time that he asks her to talk to tell him more about herself, he turns the question to him and to his own interests. And at the same time, he presents some childish behavior with this childish draws here and this childish vocabulary. Here he's saying, I am your little friend, and he signed his name. And we can see here a sense of disregard against his friend that demonstrates her love towards him, but he answers, I already know that you love me. You don't have to keep repeating it several times. So this shows a little bit of his personality, although we don't have much data because he never wanted to give interviews, and his answers to the police, although he seems pretty normal to answer objective things about his life, when it comes about his reasons to perpetrate the crime, he's very confused. His speech is very blurry. It's not clear his reasons to perpetrate this mass murder. In a letter written in 2001, Meira seems to question the justice conclusions regarding to his criminal responsibility. He says, If I make a bomb with a plastic explosive and I implode them all, they will still think that I am normal. And at another time, he belittles psychiatrists' diagnosis as a superficial attempting of labeling him. They say I have schizoid tendencies and that I act, and that the act I committed was the result of intimate aggression. This case too was known as the Realengo Massacre. On April 7 in 2011, the crime that became known as Realengo Massacre occurred in a school located in the Realengo neighborhood on the west side of the city of Rio de Janeiro. The 23-year-old shooter, Oliveira, a former student of the institution, presented himself to the school concierge as someone who was going to give a talk at the conference. In his knapsack, he was carrying 2 guns and a speed loader. Once inside the school, he entered the 8th grade classroom of elementary school, where he used both firearms both in both hands at the same time, and shot the students. 12 people died and another 12 got injured. It was the most lethal massacre or mass murder that happened in Brazil up to now. Here I have an excerpt of Oliveiras' video manifesto. He recorded many videos actually, and he had some written notebooks as well. But in a manifesto, he says, I died for those who are unable to defend themselves, who are ridiculed, assaulted, humiliated, who suffered at the hands of cruel and cowards to take advantage of their ingenuity and weakness. I died to inspire you, brothers, to defend yourselves and to get stronger. My wish is to inspire future brothers, generations. Nowadays, there is the internet. There are sites where you can create communities for brothers to meet. There are sites where you can learn how to make bombs. Together, you can prepare far greater attacks against the infidels. His speech has, in his speech, he mistakes religious contempt with contempt towards bullying issues and society problems, and it's very confusing sometimes. So he says, together can preparate for greater, yes, to the infidels. I want to remember Brother Shaw, and he mentions, especially mentions Shaw, who was the perpetrator from the Virginia Tech massacre in the United States. He refers to the Sigma School in Salvador, Bahia, here in Brazil, attack perpetrator, and to Freitas, perpetrator of the Taiúva, São Paulo, Brazilian attack. And although, he says, although you are already sleeping, it's a way of saying that they are already dead because they committed suicide, I congratulate you and ask you, brothers, never forget those brothers. Consider them icons on the fight against the unfaithful. Together, you can wait for something we all wait, that the bad are extinct. May God bless you. Here I have some pictures of Wellington, his Oliveira, he's the perpetrator of Realengo Massacre, and he's posing exactly like Shaw, who is the perpetrator of Virginia Tech massacre in the United States. So this contagion effect is a real thing. My research showed me that, and that they really get inspired by others perpetrators, and as they are as many people they can kill, they feel more valorized, and they are considered as a hero among that community, or among that brotherhood, as they used to call themselves. And the case 3, the Suzano massacre, On March 13 in 2019 in Suzano, São Paulo, Monteiro, 17 years old, and Castro, 25 years old, both former students at the school professor Raul Brasil, killed 5 students and 2 school employees. Before the attack in a car shop near the school, they've also killed Monteiro's uncle. After the school shooting, Monteiro killed his partner and committed suicide. In addition to the use of firearms, the school's internal cameras recorded several moments in which Monteiro also killed some students from blows inflicted with an axe. The attack was the second major school shooting in Brazil after Realengo massacre in 2011. Who were Monteiro and Castro? They've left many things written, not exactly a manifesto, but here is the Twitter that Monteiro used. It's his nickname. It was discovered by the police during the investigation. So he says, it's close. It's going to be like going to a war, but it would be much easier and much fun and funnier. And he writes a lot of things criticizing the government and criticizing society and his colleagues at school. And he writes, I don't understand why people treat the art of killing, he calls killing an art, of something so terrible, because it's natural. Any living being that feel bored by something recurs to killing. And here he says this narcissistic component. We can see here very clear. My place is not here. I belong to somewhere superior to all this pathetic thing. He refers to the country, to the society, and he feels above this everything. He feels special. He feels smarter. He feels like someone who can understand things much better than other people do. And here we have Castro Facebook with violent content, um, a lot of photos where he's carrying a gun, and photos of guns and content, violent content of many types. So this is what social media tells us about them. And what is very interesting in a sad way about this crime, this mass murder, is that they've announced the crime in those chans, those dark web forums. This is the board. It's a print of a board of dark web forum where he posted an excerpt of the song Pumped Up Kicks by Foster the People. It's the name of the band. And it's saying, all the other kids with the pumped up kicks, you better run, outrun my gun. And then repeat, and you better run faster than my bullet. It's about Columbine. The song is about the Columbine shooting, the Columbine mass murder. And he uses the song as a signal that he's going to perpetrate the massacre. And it's a code to the other members of this Chen that they are ready. Everything has been planned, and they are ready to perpetrate the massacre. Unfortunately, it wasn't seen by authorities. They were not investigated. Nothing happened, even though they announced they were about to perpetrate a mass murder. And here the contagion effect. Another time, here Monteiro is dressed in a very similar way of Eric Harris and Klebold from the Columbine massacre. The hat that they're using, the dark clothes, and a game that Monteiro used to play, a violent game He's dressed in the day of the attack. He was dressed exactly like the character. Here you can see the color of the clothes, and this mascara he used, his this protection for his face. He's using just like the one the character is using as well. Here again in his Twitter, it's in Monteiro's Twitter. He worships Timothy McGive, and he calls him the biggest mass murder of the story. And he says that he elevates the art of mass murdering mass murder, and he says that people follow him and will be following him for a lot of time still. And he calls him a brave man. And here we have Oliveira from Realengo Attack in a pose here as Jesus Christ. They treat him as a hero, as a martyr, as someone who died for their cause. So he must be venerated, he must be cultivated and remembered by the other brothers, as they call themselves. And here Monteiro poses just like Oliveira, who posed just like Chaves did before committed the massacre in Virginia Tech. Regarding to legal repercussions and prevention mechanisms, this year, 4 students were allegedly planning a mass murder at their schools, and they were detained and investigated by the police. But in all cases, the Brazilian police received alerts from U.S. authorities, such as U.S. Embassy and the FBI, who monitored message exchange between those potential perpetrators or social media and their participation in internet forums. The fact that these articulations have been dismantled with the help of U.S. authorities demonstrates that the issue here was not yet efficiently faced by the authorities involved in criminal prosecution and by the government intelligence agencies, in the sense of providing prevention protocols mechanisms. In addition, suspects end up being released after providing clarification to the police, as mass killings are usually classified as multiple homicides, which inhibits the possibility of an effective intervention and punishment towards preparation acts. What I mean is that if they are just preparing the act, if you're just discussing about committing a mass murdering, discussing about how to buy a gun, how to kill as many people as they could as they can in an attack, it's not a crime per se. But if they buy a gun illegally, okay, it's a crime, so police can do something. But if it's just the intention, if they manifest, if they express just the intention of commit a crime, the police can do anything because it's not a crime. It's just a preparatory act. So before they actually start the act of perpetrating a mass murder, there's nothing that the police can do. So it's a very complicated thing that authorities here have to deal with, and would be a possibility of punishing preparatory acts using the law 13260 regarding terrorism. Nevertheless, mass murders can't be classified as terrorism if the perpetrator motivation do not fit the strict category of xenophobia, discrimination, or prejudice based on race, color, ethnicity, and religion. And as Jessica said in her presentation, sometimes there's not a feeling of hate against a specific group of people. The ultimate intent is to kill. So they want to kill people. It doesn't matter any of those aspects here. Sometimes, yeah, but in the majority of cases, especially in schools here in Brazil, they don't try to kill special victims. They want to kill as many people as it is possible. So it's not a possibility to classify this act as terrorism and to punish them for those preparatory acts because it's not considered an act of terrorism if those uh, subjective elements are not present in the case.
My apologies, Anna. Yes, great.
Okay.
We are
I've
actually
just
over time. I didn't want to interrupt you while you were going, but want to thank so
But
much
thank you.
for our two speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank
Yeah.
you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Sorry we didn't get to any questions, but feel free to submit any questions through the app as well. And again, thank you to our speakers, to Jessica and to Anna. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.